So I guess we'll just start with introductions. Thank you to everybody for being here. I'm Alka, this is Jackson, and we are the co-chairs of the Science Communication Committee for Project Bridge. Project Bridge, if you're not yet familiar with it, is a student-run science outreach organization. We have various committees and projects that all engage in different aspects of trying to connect scientists with our local communities. There are Project Bridge branches at various universities around the country, not just Hopkins. And the goal of our committee, the Science Communication Committee, is primarily to connect scientists with resources for improving science communication, and secondarily, to actually engage in science communication and bring opportunities for the general public to engage with conversations about science, the practice of science, in a hands-on and direct way. And we are very excited and appreciative to have Annalee Newitz here to talk to us today. They're the author of 3 novels, most recently The Terraformers, previously The Future of Another Timeline, and the Lambda award-winning Autonomous. They're also a science journalist and have written several nonfiction books, as well as many articles on science for various publications. And they also co-host the podcast Our Opinions Are Correct, which is actually exactly about the interaction between science fiction and actual science, which ironically, I don't know if Jackson knew, but I did not even know when we thought of inviting them here. But yes, if you haven't listened to the podcast or read any of their work, you should do that. Easy to find on the internet, and obviously we'll be dropping links after. And with that, Annalee, take it away.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to Malka and Jackson for reaching out. This is one of the topics that I'm most passionate about, is how to bring scientific ideas and discoveries to the public in ways that will get the public excited and help people understand why we invest money and time into, scientific projects that are basic science as well as applied science, which you might see more in the biomedical field. So I thought I would start by kind of telling you about the work that I do and the extremely strange career path that brought me here to being a science journalist who also writes science fiction. I started as an academic. Back in the 90s, I was in graduate school at Berkeley, and I was studying I was doing basically American studies, which is an interdisciplinary field that brings together social science methods with some of the kind of analytical tools we get from the humanities. In the humanities, we spend a lot of time looking at cultural texts and trying to understand how they affect us, how they affect history, and how they affect politics. So I did a dissertation which I could describe in 2 different ways. One would be to say, I spent a really long time watching horror movies and reading science fiction novels and wrote about that. The other way would be to say that I was using social science methods to think about how changes in the economic fortunes of people in the United States affected the kinds of stories that they were willing to pay money for. So I was looking at pop culture stories that were about monsters and madness, and kind of tracking how those stories changed throughout the 20th century as the United States dealt with economic setbacks like the Great Depression, dealt with the Cold War, and other transformations, and how those affected the stories. So that got me super interested in how I could be thinking about pop culture as a way of discussing social issues. And what happened was, when I graduated, like many people who have academic degrees or have PhDs, I discovered that the job market was not as robust as one might hope. So I spent a lot of time working kind of at the edges of academia, and also working as a journalist. And eventually it turned out that it was actually easier to get a job working as a full-time journalist than it was to get a job in academia. So instead of writing about the cultural effects of mass culture, I started producing mass culture and writing for magazines and newspapers about technology. This was at sort of the beginning of the commercialized internet. So I was writing a lot about things like the rise of Google, which is kind of funny to think about now. At one point, I was chatting with like Sergey Brin on the phone, and he was like, "Oh, dude, if you write about our company, I'll send you a free T-shirt." So I never got that fucking T-shirt, which is a bummer, but they did become a giant mega corporation, so whatever. So I went from there toward getting more and more interested in science. This was kind of the early days of what was then called bioinformatics, and which is now kind of just generally how we do biology and how we do scientific discovery. And so I slowly got sucked into, first I covered biotech, and then I got really interested in geology and environmental science. And I did a postdoc for science journalists at MIT, and kind of got a crash course in how to tackle science like a scientist instead of like a humanities person. And I started writing for, I had begun by writing for kind of alternative newspapers where it was very easy to have a political perspective and nobody kind of questioned that that would be something you might do. And I slowly started writing for more mainstream publications like Wired and the New York Times and the Atlantic, where when you're doing science journalism, the idea is to present something as factually as possible, and to, do fact checking, to not advance a particular opinion about the science, but just to report on the science. And like I said, to be as factual and accurate as possible. And my experience with that was really great. But I did find myself kind of wanting to do a little bit more, and to write things that allowed people to not just understand the science, but understand it in a cultural context or a political context or historical, to understand how science functions within our cultures, as not just kind of looking at it in isolation, like, oh, I found a thing in a lab and now that thing exists and let's not worry about what people do with it. So things really shifted for me when in 2008, I started running a blog called IO9, which was part of the Gawker Media Network, which is a really large, there's like one person like, yeah. It was part of a blog network called Gawker Media that was that got quite a bit of traffic at that time, in the tens, I guess, or in the teens, in the aughts and the teens. And so I was working with a staff of about 8 to 10 people. And the mandate of IO9 was to cover both science and science fiction. And I really conceived of it in the same mold as a very popular magazine from the 1970s called Omni, which was actually one of the very first science magazines ever run by a woman. Typically, those magazines and publications had been run by men for the usual reasons having to do with misogyny and stuff like that. And Omni was incredibly influential. It brought a lot of science fiction writers to people's attention, but also they were willing to cover a lot of really cutting edge science around what eventually became biotech and the internet, but at the time seemed much more wacky in the 70s and 80s. So at IO9, I was almost completely, somebody says, I still have copies of Omni. That's great. I do too. And so I was covering science almost exclusively. And my colleague, Charlie Jane Anders, was kind of running the pop culture side. And she and I do a podcast together now. So we've continued that spirit. But the more that I was thinking about that interplay between science and science fiction, the more interested I got in writing some science fiction of my own. I, of course, had been reading science fiction since I was a kid, but I've always been, really up until that point, I always felt like I wanted to just write the truth, like let's stick strictly to the facts, like make sure that people understand how climate change works, or, how a germline, brings new traits into a species or whatever. Like, I wanted to just tell it like it is with an evidence-based model. And what I found was that there are certain kinds of truths that you can tell in fiction that you can't really responsibly tell in nonfiction. And I'll give you a couple of examples that kind of pushed me over the edge into writing my first novel, Autonomous. One is something that happened to me early in my career, after I graduated with my PhD and was like, what am I doing? And I was working at this free weekly newspaper called San Francisco Bay Guardian. And this is again, this is going to sound very old, but this was at the dawning of Wi-Fi being widely available in public spaces. And it was a lot of people found it quite bizarre and hard to understand. Like, what? First of all, what is the internet was a big question at that time, but also you can get on the internet using like stuff in the air. So I was writing a lot about this and trying to teach my readers about Wi-Fi. And I stumbled across this local guy in San Francisco who was building his own antennas out of cans, which was really cool to me. And also he was doing it because he was stealing Wi-Fi from a company that was, kind of across town from him, but it was within line of sight from his cantenna. And again, I thought this was so great. Like, here's this guy, he's really technical. He's figured out a way to get free internet by just building antennas out of coffee cans. So I wrote the story about him and his work and how he was working with other people who were trying to get free Wi-Fi in San Francisco. The story comes out, it's a cover story, everybody's jazzed. The guy who I wrote about, who was my hero for setting up this whole network, got fired immediately from his job. And he was a techie. He wasn't working with Wi-Fi in his day job. But his company felt that it made them look bad because he was stealing, even though technically, it's a question. Was he really stealing? He was just kind of using a network. This was before the days of like downloading movies and stuff like that. He was just using it to like do email and get on the web. So anyway, that made me super sad. And I was like, I want to tell stories about people like that, but I don't want them to get fired. And as I was reporting out some of my nonfiction books, I would have these moments where some of my sources, like scientists or technologists, would tell me personal stories about things they'd done that were either kind of unrelated to science or that showed that they weren't perfectly obeying all the rules. And I couldn't, and it really shed light on the kind of work they were doing. Like, it was stuff that was relevant to who they were, but I was scared. I didn't want to tell stories about people cutting corners in the lab, not even cutting corners, but like maybe ducking regulations that were actually unfair regulations or questionable. And this is not, by the way, like people doing experiments on live animals. This was mostly like technology stuff. So it's not like they were like, fuck the IRB or something like that. It was much less problematic than that. So I didn't want to get anyone else fired. So I was like, why don't I write a novel about someone who is questioning the laws around the way pharmaceuticals are being distributed to people and is figuring out ways to take matters into her own hands, reverse engineer these drugs that are helping people, and is distributing them to people as a way of getting my audience to think about all of the morally problematic areas in pharmaceutical development. So that became my first novel, Autonomous, which is about a pharmaceutical pirate she's living about 150 years in the future. She has like a badass submarine that she uses to cross the Arctic Sea, which of course is free of ice at that point. And she's got, a mass spec that fits in her pocket. She's got a 3D printer that can print up, drugs that are gene therapies. And she's stealing patented drugs that companies are selling at extremely high prices, reverse engineering them and distributing them for low cost or for free. She's a Robin Hood of the pharmaceutical world. And she's being chased down by mercenaries who've been hired by one of the pharmaceutical companies whose drugs she's stealing. And one of the mercs who's chasing her down is a very, very gender confused robot named Paladin, who is struggling with their programming and is kind of dealing with what it means to be an intelligence that's been built, and how do you kind of gain control of your mind when other people have programmed you to have certain feelings and certain desires. And so it kind of became a story about drugs affecting biological minds and programming affecting technological minds. And of course, there's also like gay robot sex in there too, just to make it extra good. And so that novel did quite well. People seem to really like it. And a lot of folks working on AI actually have told me that they've brought it into their companies. They've had conversations with their colleagues about the character who is struggling with their programming, and it's sort of gotten people talking about how gender fits into AI programming, because Paladin is quite gender confused, and you'll have to read the book to find out how that gets resolved. So I decided that if I could, I would try to balance my time between writing nonfiction books about science and science fiction books. And I've been really lucky that it's so far working out. I'll spend kind of a year and a half working on a fiction novel, and then about a year and a half working on a nonfiction book. And so after I did Autonomous, I did a novel called Future of Another Timeline, which is about time traveling feminists. That is my least scientific book. I was quite disappointed to discover that time travel, once I start talking to physicists, because when I start a fiction book, I always start by talking with scientists. And I talked to a few physicists and they were like, we're going to let you down easy here, but no, like, that is not a thing. There will never be time travel, no matter what, various SciComm folks might claim. So they helped me kind of think about how to present it in a scientific way without, sort of present what science would do if time travel existed. But at the same time, like I said, that the time travel itself is a fantasy. And while I was working on that, of course, I was thinking about time travel a lot, because I was also reporting out my nonfiction book called Four Lost Cities, which is about new developments in archaeology that help us understand why people come to cities, but also why they abandon them. And I picked 4 different ancient archaeological urban sites ranging from 9,000 years ago to about 1,000 years ago, and looked at why people had abandoned them, but also why people loved them, because I personally love cities and I wanted to think a lot about that. So I had sort of a two time travel tales. And then my most recent novel, The Terraformers, is back to, I would say, quite hard science. Like, all of the science in the book is based in reality, or in potential reality. It's about a group of people terraforming a planet, trying to bring a rocky, barren world into a Pleistocene-like environment. And so it features a lot of environmental engineers. It's also set 60,000 years in the future, which means I get to have essentially perfect synthetic biology, where you can build a person from scratch in a tank. And as a result, people can be a lot of different things. So of course there's still Homo sapiens, because everyone has nostalgia for Homo sapiens for some reason. But there's also kind of knockoff Homo sapiens who are called Homo diversus, who have different traits that make them better adapted for different environments. And of course there's also, because it was the pandemic and I really needed comfort, there's a lot of non-human animals who are people. So there's naked mole rats who are biotech workers and biologists. There's a major character who's a moose, who has a somewhat rocky romance with another moose, which is extraordinarily delightful to me. And one of the main characters is a cat. One of the other characters is a bus, well, a train, I guess, a train bus. So it's really a story about bringing together environmental science and biotech to think about what kind of worlds we might build in the future, and how an interstellar real estate corporation might screw all that up. And I'm currently working on a nonfiction book right now that is going to come out next year, which is a history of psychological warfare in the United States, which was extremely depressing to write about. But it's kind of back to my roots in social science. And then my next nonfiction book is going to be about field work. So I'm going back to environmental work. So before I finish up and open it up to chatting with you guys, I wanted to just say a couple of things that I've learned from this weird journey through academia and popular media and writing lots of books about robot sex and ancient cities and all that stuff. I often find that people ask me like which I prefer. Like, do I like nonfiction more than fiction? And people have funny assumptions about it. Like, I've had science journalism friends say like, oh, now that you've had novels that did really well, I guess you've made it, like that's somehow the measure of success. That's not how I see it. I see them fitting together really, really well. As I said, I feel like you can tell truths in fiction that you can't always tell in nonfiction, and obviously vice versa. In nonfiction, of course, you can cite all your evidence and you can talk about things that are based in scientific consensus, and help the public understand what we know about the world. So I would be extremely sad to lose either one of those things, and I love them both equally. I'm polyamorous with my with my output. I love them both. And I think that fiction can serve as the cultural wing of the scientific project. I think it can help bring scientific methods into the world as ways of kind of philosophically engaging. Things like evidence-based analysis, the idea that truth is a collaborative project, that we all work together on finding a hypothesis, and that the hypothesis is always subject to revision. I think the idea that truth changes over time through consensus is a really important idea, not just for science, but also for democracy. And I think that one of the things we can do in fiction is show how those scientific ideas and discoveries get worked out in social context. For me, that's really the most important part. Oftentimes you hear scientists and technologists say, I was inspired by science fiction to build a thing, an object, or a technology that I read about in a book or I saw in a movie. From my perspective as a science fiction writer, that's doing it wrong. Science fiction is not there to just give you an idea for building a tricorder or a space elevator, or how to build a cat with human intelligence. It's really there to show you how those discoveries would be used in a social context and abused, how a corporation might appropriate them and use them in a way that's destructive, or how a government might prevent certain people from getting access to new technologies in a way that's equally destructive for, say, marginalized communities or frontline communities dealing with climate change. So that's the beauty of science fiction, is that it's a story. It's not about the little things in the story. It's about how those discoveries, how the science fits into that context. And I think it's really important both for scientists and the public to think about that. Like when we invent something like, when we unleash something like ChatGPT, that app that will do generative AI text stuff, how's that going to be used? I mean, I think we're all thinking about that right now, but what we really need is, stories that give us a realistic look at where AI is taking us. It's not going to turn us into paper clips. It's just going to start, reinstituting all kinds of bias into our lives in a new way. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I sit, is to try to tell stories that contextualize science, tell nonfiction tales that help the public understand what science has brought to us. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I'm happy to chat take questions, whatever you like.
Thank you. So obviously we would like everybody to have the opportunity to ask questions, but I guess we can jump in with some questions. I know Jackson and I have lots of things we're curious about. So one thing that I really appreciated about both Autonomous and the Terraformers was, without like giving too much away, how I guess I would say like failures of science communication seem to be big plot points of both of those, where
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, so like for, you know, if anyone hasn't read the books yet, I'm not going to spoil it, but in both of those novels there are key plot points that have to do with whether scientists can or will disseminate their findings to the public before corporations grab those findings and privatize them or even use them for nefarious purposes. And yeah, I guess something that I've been thinking about a lot, again, obviously in biomedical sciences, this becomes incredibly relevant, is like how we can do that correctly, right? Do that communication correctly and make information accessible to the public in ways that are helpful and not being co-opted by profit-driven interests. And I guess something I'm curious about is if, you know, if you had any broader advice on that outside of the pretty cool things that go on in your novels.
Yeah, it's true. Like both of those novels have like either they deal with scientists talking to the media, or they actually have a journalist character and who is trying to talk about scientific trying to talk about science that's being used against people, basically. I mean, it's a tough question because you know, being a scientist is not a static thing. Like you can be a scientist who works at a corporation, like you might be working at Genentech, or you might just be working at Johns Hopkins, right? But even if you're at Johns Hopkins, you might be, you know, funded by a grant that you know, puts barriers around how you're allowed to communicate your results. Obviously, if you're working at a corporation, oftentimes you sign an NDA, so there's nothing you can do, even if the company is misrepresenting your work, other than quit or maybe form a union. And okay, so Malka says, I mean, academic scientists. Okay, that makes it a lot easier. But I do think that my comment about grants is important here, because it is many academic scientists are in a situation where they're heavily dependent or wholly dependent on grants to continue their work. And so it's obviously really important to understand, when you get that kind of funding, how that's going to structure the way that you communicate your findings. Like, are you going to have to run it through an organization? And even if you're at a university, you're going to have, you know, a public information officer, or you're going to have some kind of group that is working on coming up with ways to publicize your work. So it's important to know, I mean, on a base level, like what it is that you have to do to get that work communicated to the public. Like, who do you need to talk to at your organization? Are you allowed to communicate it on your own? Like, do you have a blog for your lab where you can kind of write up your results in a way that you feel comfortable with? So those are good questions to ask as you're starting out. Another thing to think about is, are you going to be able to make your data open? If you're generating data, or if you're working with a data set, can you tell the public what data sets you're working with, or how you've gotten your data sets? I think open data is a huge part of science communication, because it allows not just other scientists, obviously, to look at what you're doing and help understand the data, but also it lets journalists understand the context of the work that you're doing and see for themselves what's going on. So I think that's another piece. And then I think, it's very hard. The thing that I often run up against is that I think it's hard for you to be a working scientist and also be a writer at the same time and advocate for yourself, because you're busy, especially, if you're running a lab. But even if you're working in a lab, you're also insanely busy, and like maybe even more busy than the PI in some ways. And so it's important to, if you're very interested in getting your work out there, to think about where you want that work to be written about or talked about. Like, do you want the New York Times to write about it? Do you want someone on TikTok to make a really cool video about it? Like, do you want both? Because that's where you have to start, is thinking about where you think that you're going to reach the public, and then start figuring out who are the people in that space who are writing articles or making videos or doing podcasts that you think are good, that you think are actually accurate, that reflect someone who's not trying to sensationalize, or someone who really understands the implications of your work. So it kind of means spending a lot of time consuming media and getting media savvy yourself, and then you can reach out on your own to those creators, right? You can just get in touch with someone who has a podcast and say like, hey, I have a new paper. Here's the abstract, or here's a description of it that's like written for the lay audience. And are you interested in talking about it? It's not, in my experience, it's not that common to hear directly from scientists. And I always take it much more seriously when I do. Because PR people just bombard you with garbage all the time. But if like an actual scientist reached out to me and was like, hey, I have this paper I think you might be interested in, it's much more likely that I would check it out, because I'd be like, oh, they actually know my work and they actually are sharing their real work with me, not some silly piece of PR. So those are some basic things. Does that answer the question, or was there something more like specific that you were wondering about?
No, that was all really helpful. It was actually more specific than I was initially thinking, where I was kind of thinking more about I guess like less about individual findings and more about like it was almost kind of like a hopeless question of like, what can individuals in academic science do to like make information more freely available, given that obviously private industry is so much bigger and really dominates the space. But I think like what I'm hearing from you is, just be that change and start small.
Start with your own work, because you can't, systemic change is not possible from one lab or one researcher, but you can set the tone. And I think one of the things that I love about science is that in the best case scenario, you create kind of a family of researchers, where like an elder researcher like mentors younger people, and you can model that behavior for people that you're mentoring and show them like healthy ways of connecting with the public and the media. So again, there's nothing wrong with having a blog or a YouTube channel, or like TikTok, if TikTok is still legal in 2 years or whatever. And just reaching out yourself, letting the public know yourself.
I think we're gonna toss this over to Sue now, and then perhaps some follow-ups on that.
Hi. Annalee, I'm just fangirling all over the place, trying not to just pass out because we're talking to you. This is so cool.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Sue, the librarian. So to address one of Malka's recent points very quickly, 2 other really good ways to get your science out there is write a preprint. Preprints used to be considered very uncool, and now they're really cool. There are various preprint repositories in various areas of science, and if you put up a preprint, you get a whole lot of free commentary about it to help you make it better. And also you get a timestamp, meaning it's, people can see that you had the idea first. And journals mostly don't mind now if you put up a preprint and then publish a real peer-reviewed article in their journal. So think about preprints. The other thing is, speaking of making research free to everyone, open access, OA. I'm sure most of you have probably heard about it. Hopkins does have deals with publishers to either pay the OA costs or at least give you a discount. So if you go to library.jhu.edu and go to research guides and type in the word open, you will see a research guide about open access, and it lists all the publishers with whom we have deals to either pay your costs or at least give you a discount. So I'll mention those things. Annalee, communication makes the world go round. Actually, information does, but that's my job. But communication does, and you're doing two really important kinds of communication. You are communicating factual info to lay people or non-scientists, which is really important. And you're also using fiction to illustrate some of the possible uses and misuses of science and technology. So both of those are really important. And I just wanted to say brava, and I'll stop talking now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to say, I just want to underscore what Sue was saying about open access. It's so important as someone who writes about science to be able to read the papers that people are publishing, or like I said, to have open data so I can actually look at your data sets if that's possible. The other thing I was going to suggest, kind of as I was thinking about this more, since one of your concerns is corporate appropriation of work that you're doing, and I know a lot of you are working in biomedical areas, there's no law that says your work can't include a section on ethics. Like it would be really great, I think, if in a scientific paper, the discussion section always had a bit about ethics. And a lot of writers do, like a lot of people, when they put their papers together, will be like, hey, if this were to be released into the environment, we're concerned about X, Y, and Z. Or there are appropriate and inappropriate uses for this, or even to consult a bioethicist and have them be a partner in making that scientific paper. So, and I think bioethicists are becoming much more a part of the process of scientific discovery, but there's no harm in having more. And even if you're, say, not publishing a formal paper, you're not at that stage yet. Again, if you have a blog, if you have some outlet where you can write about the ethics of what you're working on, I think that can be really helpful, because again, it's receipts, right? Like what you want to do is, if you see a corporation developing something that you think is problematic, that's related to your field, or that is actually directly growing out of your research, you can be like, hey, we actually have an essay about the problems around how this is being used, or the ethical questions that you have to ask before you develop a product out of this thing that we've discovered. And, that's something that can become very important down the line, especially if things go wrong. But even if they don't, it can be a guideline,
I actually really like that idea of adding an ethics conversation to the discussion section. And I think that for those who were at our first event of the year, where we had Jed talking about the radical political groups kind of appropriating science into their arguments, and sort of what there is that can be done about that, other than do more responsible science and don't ask questions that are unlikely to yield useful information and very likely to fire up some ideologues. I think this would be, yeah, like a great way to address that as well. Kind of having a discussion section where you talk about what this work does and does not say for, broader applications beyond the immediate findings.
But yeah, also like you said, like there's certain questions like that like should go through an ethical filter like before you even design the experiment. Like if it's like, I'd really like to ask a question about like why gender is natural or something, and it's like, but gender is a social category. Can we really plumb the depths of gender using science? Maybe not. Maybe that's a social science question, or like a cultural analysis question, and maybe science can just go back to doing things that we can actually develop a hypothesis about. So yeah.
I have to say another question that we had beforehand, you very nicely answered in the talk, which was going to be sort of how you see like science communication in the nonfiction arena versus in the fiction arena as complementing each other, interacting. And I think we got a really nice explanation of that. So I guess, unless anyone else has another question, I'm going to jump in with one really out of left field. But you mentioned gender just now, and something that I appreciated in general about your first novel, Autonomous, was how there's no happy ending and there isn't quite any good guy. Like it ends, satisfactorily and things come to a good conclusion, but like there's not like some clean and nice, like everything tied up. And also, even your kind of like hero character, Jack, has some complications in terms of her behavior towards other characters.
She does, yes.
Yes. But one thing that I particularly like kind of thought was, this is going to sound kind of stupid, but like almost pretty brave. And I was curious, like, if you got pushback for that and sort of like how you talked about that, was the decision to have Paladin kind of decide that they would adopt a certain gender essentially to suit their relationships with other people in their lives, which social scientists would argue that does happen, and that does kind of play into how we discover who we are or form who we are, because there's not some like underlying thing to be discovered, but it also veers kind of close to some pretty transphobic tropes. And I was curious if people were upset that you had made that plot choice, and sort of like did you have to like explain that to folks? I thought it was really cool and kind of complexified a lot of things. But yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. And let me try to unpack it a little bit. So this isn't really a spoiler because it kind of happens halfway through the novel, but Paladin is a big military robot, like really bulky, covered in weapons, and like really designed to be used in combat or reconnaissance. And as the book begins, all of the characters who are working with Paladin and who own Paladin, because Paladin is owned by the African Federation, which is a kind of like the EU, but with a lot of African nations. And they all just call Paladin he. And Paladin's like, okay, I'm he. Robots don't really have gender. We have scenes where robots talk to each other and they're like, humans and their gender. What is that? Okay, whatever. The robots view gender as kind of like a human UX, or like a user interface. And they are somewhat indifferent to it, but they also understand that humans seem to be just like obsessed with it and constantly need it. So Paladin goes through half the book as a he. And then Paladin's human partner, who is this kind of like screwed up guy with internalized homophobia, has like, he's got the hots for Paladin, and Paladin kind of has the hots for him. And the funny part, or the thing that I wanted to do to kind of get people thinking about how homophobia works, is that this character Elias, he's very homophobic, but he's totally okay with the idea of like having sex with a robot. Like, he thinks that's totally fine. So he has no issues with that, but he's just super freaked out by the fact that like he has the hots for a guy robot. But then things happen, and he's able to, Elias, the human, is able to kind of justify to himself that maybe Paladin is really female, because there was a female organ donor who donated some like biological tissue to Paladin. And so he just decides that that makes Paladin a girl, and Paladin just wants to get laid. I mean, Paladin's like a young robot who's never fooled around. It totally has the hots for this guy. And Paladin's like, fine, if he needs to see me as a girl to have sex with me, whatever. And I'm really simplifying something that kind of gets into how Paladin has been programmed, and like what kinds of things Paladin is able to do with her programming. So in the second half of the book, Paladin is a she, and nothing changes whatsoever. Like, Paladin is the same person, but everybody starts to think differently about Paladin now that she is using she, her pronouns. And one of the things I actually did show the manuscript to several trans folks for like sensitivity readings, to kind of get feedback on like, because I didn't want it to be a trans story. It's not supposed to be that Paladin realizes that she's female. For her, it's just a human interface. Like, Paladin really is more non-binary, and had I written it later, I might have made Paladin have some kind of non-binary identification. The other thing I will say is that I wrote autonomous.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I did like that, like, you explicitly make it clear in the book that like Paladin is aware of the existence of trans people, and is like, that's not me, because I don't feel like there was like some true me that I needed to find.
Yeah, and that actually, that moment actually was suggested to me by one of the sensitivity readers, and he was like, yeah, why don't you just like have trans people in the story so that we know there's trans people, but then there's Paladin. And so thank you to Kefi, who suggested that to me, my friend and sensitivity reader. And so, yeah, but I never, like I said, that was never my intent, was for it to be like, oh, it's a metaphor for being trans. But the other thing I'll say is that this is an example of how, you know, as the political climate changes, like, stories change, because I mostly wrote this novel in I kind of wrote it between like 2013 and 2016-ish. And like, I like kind of wrote it, and I set it in a trunk, and then I brought it back out again. But it was before the rise of a lot of TERF culture in the United States. Like, it was happening in England, but it hadn't really percolated over here. And so a lot of the anti-trans rhetoric that is happening now, like, was just not in the media landscape at that time. And so I think if I were writing it now, there'd be a lot, it would be different. It would not be the same kind of story. But I really wanted to what I really wanted to highlight to people was that gender is not essential, and that gender is something that people project onto everything around them, that humans project onto everything around them, and how much it's kind of arbitrary and often kind of absurd. At the same time, like, the reason why I think it got attention from the Lambda Literary Awards was because a lot of the book is about how homophobia distorts our ability to see the truth about homophobia, and misogyny distort our ability to see what's actually happening in an AI system, or what's actually happening just in social reality. So to answer your question about whether I got pushback on it, I didn't. And I think if it were coming out now, it wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't have written it the same way, but I think people would be much more like, hey, what's going on here? The stuff in the novel that got the most kind of people giving me side eye and wanting to know if I knew what I was doing was that Jack, the human character, has a relationship with a man who's much, much younger than her and who's very vulnerable. And it's a very problematic relationship where he kind of, it's kind of dubious consent. Like, she's not forcing him, but it's not clear that he feels like he has a choice. And I did have several people say, like, is that what you meant? Did you mean it to be like dubious and problematic? And I said, yes. But some people really shipped those characters, and that really freaked me out. Like, people were like, oh my God, I love, Jack's relationship with 3Z. This character is so romantic. And I was like, no, it's not. It's really not romantic at all. It's really super fucked up. So, I mean, people are going to get what they want out of it, but that was not my intention. So, and my intention was also not to make a book that was about trans identity. Yeah, mostly my books deal with non-binary stuff anyway. Like the Terraformers, I would say, is like, I think like about 70% of the characters are non-binary, because I was just like, let's just go for it. Let's have as much non-binary as we can.
I guess the thing with Jack and 3Z is kind of what you were mentioning earlier about how like all these, many people in tech seem to have read certain mid-century novels, and instead of taking away, oh, this is how we destroy the world, taking away talking robots, how cool. Yeah, I guess it's, instead of thinking about consent and its complexities and our obligations to people based on how we're situated relevant to them, people are like, oh, how cute. Yeah, so obviously, anyone else, any questions, we would love to take them. I can keep going. Jackson, I know, has like a question that he wants to be like a closer, so I'm just going to ask another one out of left field then. But something I was curious about reading the Terraformers was how you have these characters living very extended lifespans, but they still seem to be on a 24-hour circadian rhythm. And I was wondering if like you had kind of like thought about that background framework of what that might mean in terms of their memory or experience, because that doesn't really get talked about very much in the book itself.
That's so funny that you bring that up. Actually, the novel I'm working on right now, I've been thinking about circadian rhythms a lot, because the characters live in a gas cloud that orbits the galaxy. And so they don't have day and night really. And I was like, oh my God, how would they measure time? Like, how would it affect their bodies? Like, would they have, kind of a cellular systems that respond to some other rhythm, or like, anyway. So with the Terraformers, I did not think about that. I was like, this is 60,000 years in the future. And so I do have these little hints in the background about how they have synthetic microbiomes. And so I was imagining that they were replenishing these microbiomes, that they're doing like really advanced DNA repair. And so that the kinds of wear and tear that we see on like a typical organism now just wouldn't be happening, because they would just be like perfect repair all the time. Like, we've built in a system to these bodies so that DNA replicates great until it doesn't, basically. They're on, the way that I also got around some of this is they're on a planet that's supposed to be just like Earth. So, which is a total science fiction cop out. Like, people always do that in sci-fi, like, oh, it just happens to be exactly like Earth. So they are on basically a 24-hour cycle. So I didn't have to worry about like, how are they going to change like this fundamental part, not just of human, DNA, but like all of the life forms in the ecosystem are all on this day-night cycle. And so, yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't think about that more, but I promise that the next book, book will have some circadian rhythms.
Oh, my
or lack
question
thereof.
wasn't even so much about I mean, that was all cool. I think what I was struck by the most was like, what would it be like to live 24-hour days as we do, but then to live like a power of
so
10
many
more of them? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just imagining that, because that was the norm for them, that would just, you would kind of, it's like so as a journalist, like if you're writing for a daily paper, you're churning out stories every day and the editorial process is very short, right? You just like squish it up. But if you're writing for a magazine where like the editorial horizon is like 6 months out, like they're programming stories that far out, suddenly editing takes like 5 months. And it's just like, you just invent ways to like stretch the editorial process out. And believe me, it's really annoying and horrible. It's like, imagine peer review, but like with even worse feelings. And so I kind of imagine that you would just, you would have a different sense of time. You would kind of, things that to us we would imagine take a year, for them would take decades. Like maybe you would be in college for much longer, or, well, these characters don't go to college because they're enslaved, but they, like, a lot of processes that they're dealing with in the terraformers are environmental processes that take centuries. So they're like, oh, I'll take on a project that's going to take a century because I'm tweaking the food webs in this area, and you can't do that in a week or a month or a survey season. So yeah, I was kind of thinking of it that way. And we have characters who, have done lots and lots of different weird stuff over their lives, and it's just part of their life resume is that they got to build a forest and harvest minerals from a volcano and, do all kinds of things that no normal lifespan right now would ever encompass.
Thanks. Jackson, did you want to go next, and then we'll wrap it up unless somebody. Oh, sorry, that was just feedback because we're sitting next to each other.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this talk. This has been incredible. So I guess one thing that I've been thinking about a bit, and it kind of came up with what you had spoken about, but in terms of like publishing negative data. So we had published, we actually had filed a report, so with the DoD, we had a lot of negative data, and they actually rejected the negative data. So we had to craft some story that seemed somewhat optimistic but still was negative, and eventually they accepted it and we published the negative data. And it's a weird paper, and I don't think it's the best paper, but it's not falsified data, but it just, they literally denied it, and I didn't know that was possible. So I kind of think about, yeah, and then I kind of think about in terms of like science fiction writing and some of the scientific audiences that I think about, maybe one of my PIs, people like that, that have been in the field for a while, and kind of having an open eye to some of the science fiction writing, and how like what you mentioned, how you can tell some stories in fiction that you're not really able to tell, with nonfiction. And essentially where I'm going with this is, do you ever have I guess like kind of maybe on a more personal level, like, is it hard for you to write your science fiction, like with your last story, not the most recent one, but in terms of like time and such, do you wonder how it will be interpreted? And does that kind of make you write in a certain way ever? Or are you more open to writing freely and, potentially, like, I think fiction is important for driving science in a lot of ways that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So you're asking, like, do I worry about how scientists might interpret it and like take the wrong message from it?
Yeah, either that, or also maybe if you have ideas for a novel, and like maybe certain ideas for how it could be interpreted, if people just shoot it down because it's labeled as nonfiction or something like that.
So I'm not sure I understand the second question. Like, people shoot it down because it seems too non-fictional, or like because
Yeah,
it seems like too
yeah,
on the nose or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah. Luckily, I think most of my science fiction is so weird that like it may be on the nose, but it's really hard for people to tell because it's like the story of a sentient flying train like hooking up with a cat that's a investigative journalist, right? Like it's really hard. Like I think that people just encounter it as being super weird. In the same way with Autonomous, I think people were like, oh, it's about this weird robot and like this pirate, and we don't. I mean, plenty of people got the point,
yeah,
that it was that the pharmaceutical industry is super greedy and problematic. But I definitely try to avoid being so on the nose that people read it and feel called out. I don't think that that's helpful, because when people feel called out, they shut down. They don't take in the message, or they don't allow themselves to kind of get into that safe space of imagination where they're willing to entertain ideas that they might not have encountered before, or ideas that contradict their own beliefs. So I think it's really important to make fiction open enough that you can invite people in. And with Autonomous, I actually did make a very conscious effort to, I really wanted people, I knew a lot of people in technology who work in tech would be reading it, and that many of those people would be straight men who might be uncomfortable with the idea of like a gay robot relationship. And I wanted there to be two ways to read the book. One way is like, it's a gay robot relationship. And one way is like, it's much more complicated than that. This robot doesn't really have gender. And like, actually, this human isn't sure what the gender is. And the robot doesn't care because, like I said, the robot just wants to get laid, which I think is very relatable. And so I wanted there to be these two pathways where you could get to the same place, but like not have to go to somewhere that's too uncomfortable. And in the Terraformers, I did very similar things where I felt like there's a lot of pathways through that story that are extremely weird. And there's other pathways that are pretty normal. And you could just be like, oh, it's a fun story about revolution on another planet. And it raises a lot of questions about how environmental science is done and how genetic engineering is done, but you don't have to like you can read the novel in that way without kind of going on some of the byways that the novel might take you to. So I like to do that in my books, to like offer people multiple pathways that are kind of like the really weird, difficult path, or the like easier, fun path. I try to make them fun. I think the one exception is my novel Future of Another Timeline, which was just like straight up about murdering incels and like why abortion is awesome, and like why women are great. And not surprisingly, that was not a big commercial hit for me. So a lot of people just threw that book across the room. It's funny because that's the book that people either love the most, like it's their deepest, most beloved thing, or they just freaking hated it. And whereas I think my other books have either people are like, oh, that's okay, or they like it, with a few exceptions, obviously. So yeah, it's a delicate line to walk. And I have to say, that's one of the things I love about nonfiction, because in nonfiction, you're just describing stuff that's real. If you're doing your job correctly, which I try to do, like, you're just like, look, this is how the world is. Like, this is what we know. Like, here's a bunch of scientists. Like, here's some debates they have. But like, basically, like, yeah, climate change, it's happened in the past. It will happen in the future. Like, here's the ways that it occurs. Or, here's the ways that, we understand ancient people first built cities. Like, there's no like on the noseness about it, because it's like, that's just real. So I think whenever I get too on the nose in my feelings, that's when nonfiction is really there for me. And that was why I wanted to do a book about psychological war, because I felt like this is happening all around me. I don't want to write some dumb allegory in science fiction about like, oh, the government is watching you through some futuristic surveillance device. I was like, I could actually just write about what's going on and talk about the history of it and where it comes from and help people understand how we got to where we are now. So yeah, that's definitely, and like I said, my next novel, it's about a graduate student who's a slime mold who lives outside the galaxy, who's studying Earth. And, you know, I don't think it could get less on the nose in a way. It's like, I mean, also slime molds are the greatest. I don't know if any of you guys have studied slime molds, but they're probably one of the best organisms out there. So I'm pretty excited to go there.
I will say before we bounce to our last questioner, we definitely have some union organizers who I'm sure would be delighted to talk to you about what the needs of a slime mold graduate student union might look like.
Oh my God, this slime mold and her colleagues super need to be unionized. They are being horribly abused. So yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah,
I'm actually wearing my jorts and jean shirt here. You can't really see it, but yeah, it's a union cat situation. Pro union.
Yeah, I will admit that I shared this event on our union Slack channel with the plug that everybody should come hear a talk by the writer who wrote about a graduate student being imprisoned in a 3D printer.
Yes. I have a lot of, I mean, I was part of one of the first union actions at UC Berkeley, where we were striking for recognition as a union. This was like back in the 90s. And yeah, I definitely have a lot of feelings about how graduate students are abused. I can't get away from it. I feel like almost all my books have grad students or low-level faculty who are being horribly mistreated by their institutions. So yeah, somehow grad school made an impression on me.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Waiting patiently.
Yeah, thank you, Annalee. You can hear me, right? Yeah, it looks good.
I can.
So I'm afraid it's not exactly a fun question because I have a question about misinformation and how to deal with it, because we kind of touched on the topic earlier, but only from a science point of view. And what I keep seeing is from both my science friends and my science journalist friends that every time there's a horrific claim about anything from gender to vaccines, you always can like follow the misinformation and it always gets a little less. And this seems to me closely connected to questions of economy. Like journalists do know that if they put it this way, choose a certain headline, for example, more people will click on it and they depend on it. And you can't, in the end, you can't even really blame them because they need their paper, they need their journal going. And I wonder if you have, you obviously have no solution, but I was wondering about your thoughts on that. Like, what can we do to break that line of misinformation? Because if we only publish our findings, even if we put in sections on, or even if we put in a section on the ethics or on the risks, people will still be inclined to skip that part and to make it seem more dramatic just for the clicks. And if we publish corrections and try to tell people, no, that's not what we meant, you see it on social media all the time. They get like half the views, not even half the views of the misleading article. Is there anything we can do or anything we should think about when it comes to that topic?
Yeah, it's obviously as you said, it's a huge problem. And I think it's really interesting that you thought about it kind of in an economic context of like the incentives that journalists have to try to get more audience. So, okay, there's a couple of things to know just as context, which is that oftentimes, if you're a journalist, you don't have control over your headline. So it isn't even necessarily the journalist's fault. Like, this has happened to me so many times, like where I write an article, the article is perfectly reasonable. No editor has come in and added anything sensationalistic. It's very evidence-based, but then the headline is just some bonkers bullshit. And like quite often, you'll have like an A/B test on the headline. And so they'll write two headlines, one of which is like kind of bland and one of which is the bonkers headline. And they'll test to see what people click on. And whatever gets clicked on the most over a period of like, say, an hour or 2 hours, that becomes the headline. So when you first see a story go up, you are part of a psychological test to see what will make you click, which is super frustrating, obviously. And it means that the problem is much more systemic. It's like a problem with the publications themselves, not even necessarily the writers. So there's a couple of things that I would say that you can do. One is to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier about when you want to publicize your findings, that you either go to a journalist who you trust and who you've read their work and you know that they don't want to sensationalize it, or that they're going to sensationalize it in a way that's accurate. Because one thing that I realized when I was working at IO9 and we got to see a lot of that audience data, is that you can write like a really sassy, exciting headline that's also accurate. So, and people would accuse us of writing clickbait headlines, and I'd be like, no, but this story is actually about the thing. We just made it sound exciting. And like, there is nothing wrong with making your science sexy and exciting. Like, it should be. It is. It's the best. Science is obviously the most exciting thing in the universe. And so, like, if there's a headline about, like, I'll just use climate as an example, because that was something I worked on a lot. If we had climate change in a headline, nobody would click. But if we said superstorm in a headline, people are interested in superstorms. Not inaccurate. There are superstorms. They are caused in part, I mean, I shouldn't say they're caused by climate change. They happen more frequently due to climate change. So there's that. So at any rate, finding people who are going to be accurate in their reporting and trying to deal with them is one thing. Also finding publications that you trust too, like certain publications are never going to be accurate, right? Like the Daily Mail, not going to be accurate. Like, you know, Fox News, not going to be a great way to publicize your science unless you get really lucky. But other places are much more committed to trying to be accurate and to do fact checking. And, you know, those are things that you're going to know from reading. And it's going to vary from field to field too. Like some places are really horrible about reporting on biology, but they're great about reporting on like technology. So the other thing you can do is, like I said, make sure that you also are getting your voice out there to provide those receipts. And even if, okay, let's say the misinformation gets 10 eyeballs and your accurate information only gets 5 eyeballs, because I guess one person only has 1 eye or they have 3 eyes or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's still out there. Like it isn't a failure. It means that people are seeing it. And like the way that those, again, for context, like the way that that stuff is measured is such crap. Like, you know, people will say, oh, 100,000 people watched this video, and watched means that they saw it for 3 seconds. So you don't know, like maybe the people, those 5 people actually read your information and were like, oh, now I understand like how Cas9 works or whatever. And somebody else clicked for a second on a video about how we're all being turned into mutants by George Soros and like and was just like, oh, I don't want to watch that, and turned it off, but it still registered as a view. So part of the problem is our data is not very accurate, but we do see this misinformation circulating, and it's obviously affecting politics. It's obviously affecting how people deal with pandemics. And I think, unfortunately, the answer really is like, it's a big, long problem, and we have to provide that information, try to just keep making sure that the truth or that the evidence is available, and realize that like, this is a long-term project. Like, you're going to be teaching your students about this. They're going to be teaching their students about this. Like, we're going to have to keep, this is a generational project. The scientific project is not happening just now. It's like things that you write now in 10 years could come to fruition. Like, people in 10 years might be like, oh yeah, like there's this group over here who've been making all of this information available to us. Now we fully understand, like, actually we should wear masks or whatever, right? Like anything like that. So it's, I mean, we're in a very dark time for misinformation. It's really, a big part of it has to do with how social media has been developed. And I believe that right now we're actually having a big shift in how we're going to be handling our social media and how it's going to be designed and how it's going to be moderated. It's going to be a giant frickin' mess for a few years. Obviously, I think you've probably all noticed the giant frickin' mess. But I think we're going to come out on the other side, hopefully with some regulations, hopefully with some self-regulation that makes it harder for misinformation to circulate in such a pernicious way. And at that point, you want to have those receipts. You want to have been the whole time making this information available, helping people see it, talking to journalists about it, talking to not just journalists, but like science influencers, people who are like just popularizing scientific ideas. Don't assume that because you talk to someone at the New York Times that they're going to give you an more accurate story than someone on TikTok, because sometimes it's the opposite. So yeah, I think there is reason to hope, but I also think it's going to be tough for a while, and you have to expect that there's going to be a certain amount of bot generated misinformation as well as human generated misinformation. So yeah, but keep doing it, keep making that data available, keep making those papers available, make them open access, talk to people, talk to influencers and journalists and science fiction writers and
librarians
and your union. Make sure that your jobs are supporting you in a way that's allowing you to continue as scientists and not become a starving scientist like so many people I know. I don't know. I just wanted to bring it back. I just wanted to bring it back to like union now somehow. So
Absolutely.
I hope that worked.
Yes. Sorry, my brain is too broken right now to remember what I'm supposed to say. The union makes us strong, whatever. In any case, thank you so much, Annalee, for coming. Thank you to everybody for attending. We hope you enjoyed, learned something. We definitely did. And as always, we will send follow-up email with links to everything that was discussed, or at least as many of the things that were discussed as we remember to find links for.
And thank you so much for having me. This was really a pleasure. And if you have
this was
follow-up
really fun.
questions, and if you have follow-up questions or you want to tell me about your research, it's super easy to find me. I'm on the internet. I'm Annalee@gmail. Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.